Just so you know, why the Mesa History Center? Well, yes, I started here, and I started the Rolando Street Histories program. They sort of grew into the College Neighborhoods program. Was working with the College Neighborhoods Foundation. And then when we had our daughter and we had one bathroom, and we said, what are we going to do here? We ended up moving to La Mesa, and those guys kind of found me. And when the College Neighborhoods Foundation went under and decided to move that all over. And so you'll see the history of La Mesa, as you're going to hear, extends beyond what the city limits of La Mesa. This is part, historically, of what we will call La Mesa. And you'll see, because the town site was supposed to be right over here. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about how that connection goes and why we moved the archives from the College Neighborhoods Project into the archives there at the Mesa History Center. And we're open on Saturdays if you want to come by and research your house or neighborhoods or whatever for the whole greater area that sort of infesses itself as the Mesa. And like I said, this is sort of what we got. There's Doris with Council Member McCarty. So we've had good support over the years from our council members. And this, of course, when we were in Council District 7. Judy and Jim Adafford, who actually lived on the other side of 8 when this was District 7. And then, of course, later it got connected to, which I think is a good move, to connect to our East County neighbors, or East City neighbors, here in District 9. So all the evolution in time, and of course, you may have come and visited me at the history booth where we look up your house and your neighborhood and talk all kinds of fun stuff. And I'm going to share a little bit of that as I race through the program today. And so, like I said, it's ended up turning into a 4-part series, by the way. We had a 4-part series. So I'm going to try to condense it a little bit to you. So, of course, I'll always come back if you want me to talk about history and Rolando, no problem with me. But we'll just try to condense that a little bit and get you to that. So we'll talk all about this. So next slide, please. And so geographically, what are we talking? Well, the village is actually the name that doesn't arrive until about 1939, and I'll explain that. It was just known as Rolando before that, and when it opens in 1926, it's Rolando. But it's sort of the area we call the village is sort of that area that's north of University, today goes all the way out to College, and the city limit on the east side before it hits La Mesa. So that's where the village, and of course, south of University is Rolando Park, which gets its own lecture. They have a little bit connected, but a little bit different history, et cetera, as we move through this. Go ahead. And of course, that makes up more than the original 5 Rolando subdivisions, which sort of form in a little J sort of shape down here, and I'll explain that when you go through a couple of maps. And then there's other post-war subdivisions, and even a few before that, things like the Superior Heights and others that actually predate Rolando as well in the area. So we'll talk a little bit of that. So this is a little bit of geography for you. Right, so before there's Rolando, let's zip through this to get where we were. This was way out in the country, guys. And of course, our history here in Centennial County goes back, as the Kumeyaay will say, to time immemorial. That's the way they see it. That is, as long as they can remember, that is their history, and we won't be getting into that story, though it's great to hear from them. They're really engaging with us. As I mentioned, I work for state parks. I'm the chief of planning now, so I've been to many public meetings for this. I appreciate our council member rep. I've been on the same side of this, people asking questions about state parks and planning and all this, and I was a planning commissioner for the city of Mesa for about 10 years as well, until about 3 years ago when we moved over to Kensington, where we are now. So just to give you an idea, this course goes back, and of course, the Spanish colonials arrived in 1769, established near where Presidio Hill is, and then eventually moved the mission site down the river to closer to the village of Nipquay, where they had more Native Americans to try to convert, and that's why it ended up where it is today. And so then the missionaries would, of course, look from Mission Valley to the south, and they saw this big tableland that pretty much goes from today's Mission Hills up to Mount Helix, and they just called that the Mesa, right? La Mesa, tableland. And that's where that name comes from, and technically means all of that area I'm talking about, though eventually just the city, and we'll explain how La Mesa got its name and all that here in a second. So next slide. Of course, after Mexico got its independence, it becomes part of the Mexican Republic and becomes in the territory of Alta California. And is just before the American occupation, there were a lot of ranchos. This is when things moved from all the land being owned by the king and the church to being independently deeded to individuals, private owners in this case, and that's when the rancho era, the rancho. And so these lands that we are in, where you can see the star roughly where Rolando will end up being, and that blue line that sort of separates between the Pueblo lands, which is the city's lands, right, and the mission lands on the other side. Today, roughly, the Interstate 805 follows that line. It's a natural canyon. It's where they divided between the Pueblo lands of what became Old Town and the mission lands that are associated with the mission to run their stock and all the things, their fields and stuff, right? And so that's why this grant was known as the Rancho Ex Mission. And it was deeded to Santiago Arguello, who was a former comandante of the Presidio, so very well known, very respected individual. It ended up being, after about 32 years of land clearance in legal cases, would be about 58,000 acres, and pretty much goes from Rancho Penasquitos down to National City, right? And pretty much up to about Mount Helix, and of course then that line that we talk about on the west. Not a bad little land grant for doing some service for the government, huh? Not too bad back then. Of course, you got to remember, at this time, the non-Indian population of Mexican California, San Diego was probably about 400 souls, right? We're talking about slightly smaller community, right? So let's go ahead to the next slide. So this was sort of out, right? Out in the boonies, right? And so when the Americans take over in 1846, they occupy California. They then go through that, saying those proving up the land claims will take about 32 years before they get enough clear title to really start thinking about people doing much out here and developing. So people will try to buy the land, as I'll mention, but they're not really doing much because the population is still fairly small. And so in the 1870s, the official road east from San Diego out towards Cajon and off to the east to try to connect to the States followed what we called the Choice Road. The Choice Road would basically follow Home Avenue up to where it meets University about 54th, and then follow down along that creek, that's the Choice Creek bed, all the way up into what we would call the Mesa, over the pass, head east, right? And so that was officially the first county road. Then they had another cutoff that took you down towards Spring Valley, where there was an early settlement, one of the first early settlements, because that area wasn't within a rancho boundary. And so as early as 1860s, people are putting claims in on that property and being able to homestead it. So this is kind of a port. So we were along. So that is the first county road route that went down today, what we call University. Now there was another road that got surveyed a little bit later called the Cajon Road via the Mesa. You all know this as El Cajon Boulevard, right? So this comes out in the 1880s, and it was picked one because it was a little flatter. Other than this one little hill as you get up, and you may recognize it over here about 56th Street, it was the little hill, El Cerrito. Oh, El Cerrito, that's where it comes from, right? Goes back to the 1880s when that road was platted, and they say, oh, there's the little hill on this mostly flat road, the El Cerrito. And if you're on your bicycle, it's like, you probably feel it's more than a little hill, but if you're driving, it's not too bad. All right, so next slide. In the meantime, there were some attempts to purchase land. John Harbison, who was a guy trying to figure out, remember, this is a very arid climate. We didn't have those big pipes bringing the water in like we do today, right? So they were really stuck on what kind of natural rainfall. And in a semi-arid climate, we normally don't get more than about 10, 11 inches down here in this area, maybe 20 or 25 in the mountains, but about here, right? So the challenge of starting an agricultural community was a tough one. Harbison actually raised bees, and he had patents on apiaries, right, to raise bees. In the meantime, Robert Allison was a stock guy. He owned a large butcher shop. He ended up having not only the 4,000 acres, there was much of downtown La Mesa down into Lemon Grove that he owned, and he also owned part of the Rancho Cuyamaca. He owned large properties out in Campo area where he ran sheep and cattle, and then he had his butcher store downtown. So he was a very successful man who had come out here. And so those are sort of the two guys, but you can see a lot of the properties just sort of sitting, waiting for the title to be cleared after all those land cases were going on. So if we were looking about on the Mesa this time, there's not a whole lot out here, right? There's the two roads. There was a small settlement out where Massachusetts meets University, was called Chris Jepson's Halfway House, because it was halfway to the pass to get over El Cajon, right? And so you could stop there and get your horses taken care of, or maybe get something to eat or whatever. And that was sort of the only thing on your way east out of San Diego past this pretty much undeveloped Mesa land. Give me the next slide, right? Then it all changes in the 1880s. This is when the railroad gets to San Diego, right? Because the things you need not only are water here to develop, you need transportation. And in the 19th century, the thing that made a community go, the railroad, right? You need to be connected. And first the railroads get to LA, it tends to grow a little faster. And as a state park guy, I let you know, because I had to evaluate which is now Los Angeles State Historic Park, which was the original Southern Pacific Rail Yard that was given to them. One of the reasons they decided, even though they didn't have a harbor in LA, and we did, they gave them free land, and they had a direct route from the desert into LA, and LA gets the railroad first. By early 1880s, a spur line comes down the coast and connects San Diego. Now you can connect whatever you're doing here, produce, whatever, transportation to get in and out of San Diego much easier. It was extremely remote out here in the far southwestern corner of the US at this point. And so when that happens, there's this great boom, right? Hey, suddenly you can get here cheap. You had two railroads fighting in Southern California. It triggers this boom as the rates come down, so it's just $1 to come to California. Come out and bring your money and buy some land. And so you see a lot of subdivisions suddenly. The Pueblo land side, you can see, is almost suddenly full of subdivisions by the 1880s. And finally, on the other side, as with the title clearing, you begin to see some of these other grants coming in the Mission lands, including one known as the Steiner, Klauber, Choate, and Castle Edition under its marketing name of City Heights. That is, in fact, East San Diego City Heights, getting subdivided as early as 1885, right? And other places like just southwestly, this is El Cerritos, was called Waterville, trying to connect you, because the big push at that time in Southern California was, the biggest industry was citrus, right? Citrus. And so we were the place you could grow oranges year round and ship those oranges to New York in January and make some real money, right? Citrus was the thing that took off, but you needed water. You need a lot of water to do citrus. So the push of water and all that. In addition, Grantville goes back to this time. It was in fact set up to be a place where former Union soldiers could buy. This was very much a Republican town at that time after the Civil War. Was very much that was the push. And so they were supporting that, and there was the first streets, and that's why if you go down into Grantville, you'll see a bunch of names. A lot of those guys are old Union generals, like Vanderbilt and all that. That's the names of the streets, right? So that just helps you kind of connect what's happening, what's hot at this point. We're just, 15 years out from the Civil War. So some smart guys named Theodore Van Dyke and William Robinson realized, hey, it rains a lot more up in those mountains than down here. And they go ahead and build a dam at what we know now as Cuyamaca Reservoir, right there in Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, right there, right? And figure out, we'll build a dam there, get that reservoir, we'll let the water flow down that Boulder Creek, we'll create a diversion dam where it hits the San Diego River, and then through a series of flumes and tunnels, about 35 miles worth, they get the water to go all the way around the El Cajon Valley, up over the pass that we know now as Grossmont, and into a holding reservoir called the Eucalyptus Reservoir. And if you've ever been to La Mesa to Briarcrest Park, that's where the reservoir was. That's where the flume ended. From there, a ditch was set to go out to the La Mesa Reservoir, which we know as Lake Murray, and another ditch down to get water into Mr. Allison's lands, because he was one of the investors, right? And so you begin to see this, how can we get that water and turn this into something that can become an agricultural community? And thus then, the Flume Company buys Mr. Harbison's 4,000 acres and subdivides it, mostly into 5 and 10 acre lots, thinking they're gonna sell this to citrus growers. But they put the town site right on that very nice county road, the Cajon Road. And in fact, the center of the town site of La Mesa is supposed to be at today's 70th and El Cajon Boulevard. That's where the city of La Mesa was going to be. In fact, the first school created in this area, the La Mesa School, is basically right where the Tubman School is right now. This was La Mesa. Over where downtown La Mesa was Allison Springs. And so this stuff is sort of going on, right? And the flume opens in 1889. And gets water to Briarcrest. They have the dam and reservoir will be done in 1895. And we'll be able to sort of see this big vision, right? And this is great. So they're getting this done. They get the flume ready in 1889, just in time for this wonderful real estate boom to completely bust. Crash and burn. I mean, left a lot of paper subdivisions with nothing in them. And people just walking away because their paper was now suddenly worthless. It's estimated that when the boom starts in 1885, the population of San Diego is about 5,000, the city, right? About 5,000. They estimate by the peak in late 1888, it's about 40,000. By 1890, it's going to be 16,000, right? It just collapses, and people head off other places and left it behind. Anyway, but in the meantime, still there were some people who were buying properties and doing it. And what you would have seen is these sort of things. These are all from the 1890s, actually later photos, but basically the DeWitt's Ranch, which is along El Cajon. If you go, there's a William Street and DeWitt Street, and just on that side of La Mesa, that's where that ranch was. The Lookout Ranch was right next to La Mesa. It's sort of the east end of downtown on what we call Boulder Heights, and that was the Lookout Ranch. In fact, the original name of La Mesa Boulevard was the Lookout Avenue. Oh, and that's Herbie Park, who was heir to the Park Davis Pharmaceuticals, who decided to come out here and buy some land, have a little gentleman's ranch, and he ended up using the springs there and creating a little pond. And if you go to Anthony's and look out the window, that's the pond, all right? So, and he built this little, I think the barn's nicer than the house actually, but it's sort of one of those things. So these are the kinds of gentleman's ranch. So it's not a whole lot of folks. By the turn of the century, we're talking about 100 people maybe living in this very rural area. There's no real downtowns or anything at this point, just sort of that. There's the school there's going to be a school at Allison, and there's going to be a couple churches, and pretty much just a rural ag community.
Is that house still there?
No, they're gone. All three of them. in that case. We do have a couple older ones in La Mesa, but not those. At the same time, the other thing you need is that railroad, right? And the SDG-C&E, which is the San Diego Cuyamaca Eastern, which was being run by a government waterman who actually also owned the mines up at Cuyamaca. He was a mining guy, became lieutenant governor, and then when the governor passed, he became the governor. He wasn't expecting this, but anyway, he helped fund this, and that's basically where the trolley runs now. Now, let's think about this. Okay, so here's where the school, the church, right? But over there is where the railroad is. And guess where the post office ends up being? At Allison Springs, right? And suddenly the sort of focus is moving from up here on the road to, wow. And so the lemon company forms, they put the warehouse, everybody brings their fruit because they got to get it on the train, and starts to make the area we call now downtown La Mesa sort of the hub of the community from a commercial side, even though we still had a school and a church over here. So, right? And that also comes in about 1889. Such that Allison's son hooks up with another guy named Andrew Crowder, and they then subdivide around the depot there and create what they called first Allison Springs, and realizing that wasn't a very distinctive name, decided because they're in the La Mesa area and they decided to name the post office La Mesa, they changed it to La Mesa Springs. But they couldn't name the post office La Mesa Springs because there was already a La Mesa Springs post office somewhere else. So the post office said, well, you can only call it La Mesa. So now do we have some good confusion, right? Here's the La Mesa School. There's the La Mesa post office next to the Allison School. Oh, this is going to be fun here in a minute. So we get to that, right? So La Mesa Springs, of course, phones up, right? And the community begins to center because here's where you connect to get your mail and your transport if you're going to ship off your citrus or whatever. So you begin to see sort of the commercial movement over here. And there was a store and a few things over here. Mostly it was down here in now La Mesa Spring. So when we look to the newspapers in the 1890s, we see lots of interesting stories about people and the churches and the dances and the baseball games and all the things that you would see in a turn of the century rural community, centered both places, the people here as well as the people in Allison Springs. So if we look at the turn of the century, we still got the star where Rolando is going to end up being, or sort of still in between, right? You got La Mesa town site, Allison Springs in the school, the flume making its deliveries, the two roads across the mesas. Right? And there we're going to be to see. So what's already out here? You'll see there's already some subdivisions that date from this period. In what's mostly now El Cerrito, the Marcelena tract, Redlands, the Waterville, the Lemon Villa, all along the little road where the El Cerrito is. In fact, the first name El Cerrito comes to a water district, small water district they created, and will then later, by the 20s, will start to be sort of named for the area. Will just sort of fall under it. But you see that, and there's a lot of empty space. And you can see where the star is. There's a big chunk of land that is all under one piece of ownership. And the owners are actually, at this point, the Junipero Water and Land Company, which is the guys who started Grantville. They're about to go out of business, though, and the land's going to sit pretty idle for a while before somebody picks it up. Now, what's going on about the teens is there's a couple of key things that are going to help connect and make this area possibly to be developed. The first is sort of incorporation fever. In February of 1912, the little community of La Mesa Springs decides to go ahead and incorporate and becomes its own city, once again deciding to stick the name to the post office and not confuse people. They just call it the city of La Mesa. And that means at this time then, as we click the next, we also see a couple other incorporations. One is the city of El Cajon, which happens in November, pretty much just in the downtown core, as well as the folks who are living out in the mission lands on the other side of the city. The city of East San Diego will incorporate on its own in late 1912 and will actually be its own city for about 10 years. And so it's its own city. In fact, when it incorporates, it becomes the second largest city in the county, just like that, right? San Diego still being the biggest one. So you begin to see this interest in local control. This is the progressive era where local control, busting the trust, trying to get control of yourself, getting involved in community planning, all these kinds of things that were sort of getting their starts. This community, as well as La Mesa, and we're sort of connecting into that to make sure they can make decisions on budgets and water services and press services and all these other things, right? To be able to do that on their own. And so that's what we're seeing at this point. So in the meantime, La Mesa townsite becomes La Mesa Heights. They decide to rename themselves so that everybody knows that's what we're talking about up here, La Mesa Heights versus La Mesa, right? And in fact, the original school is taken down, and of all things, Irving Gill, the noted architect, who we finally found, we have a building left in La Mesa at our last year's tour. I was able to find out we still have an Irving Gill building left. Designed that. It's a small version of what, if you go to the Bishop School in La Jolla, it's a small version, was finished a year after the Bishop School. and it was just a little grammar school out here, and they converted, and it was around till about 1940 when it was torn down to put the very nice William Templeton Johnson School that was known as the Muir School and now is the Tubman School, right? So still sort of identified as its own community, but once again, not in San Diego, not in La Mesa at this point, right? A couple other key things are going to happen in the 1910s to sort of set things up. One is the movement of the Rest Haven Preventorium, which, if you know where the Valley View Hospital off of University, 54th in there, it originally started as a children's tuberculosis sanitarium, which was a big deal at this time. And actually, a lot of the buildings had started out in La Mesa and then moved there. And it operated for about 40 or 50 years before the hospital, the predecessor to current Valley View, bought it as a hospital site. So it goes all the way back to that period from a healthcare perspective. In the meantime, of course, things like the Cuyamaca Water Company, which had bought out the insolvent Flume Company, was run by a guy named Ed Fletcher, you may have heard of him, and his partner who had all the money, James Murray. Thus the dam being the Murray Dam, a cutting-edge engineering feat in 1917, a very cutting-edge concrete dam that allowed not only for it to be higher than the earthen dam from 1895, but much bigger. That's back farther. In fact, the old earthen dam is about 100 feet out in front of it, been submerged now since 1917. But that's right. So that's a very thing that helps get this local area the water sources is going to need, right? And then another thing is the Choice Heights radio station. Now, some of you all remember, you still see those things towering over us over here. There's still a monument there. They had to take them down for safety reasons, because of naval housing now. But this was part of the first worldwide radio system that allowed the Navy to be able to contact its ships anywhere in the world. There was this one here, there was a station in the Philippines, and one in DC. This allowed them to pretty much connect to any ship. So this was a very significant and helps the sort of start the connection between the Navy and the military in San Diego, which I just did a fun lecture or a fun chat with the editors at KPBS. They're doing a little military history thing on this and asked me a little bit about the history of early military connections. And this was a very key element of cementing the Navy's need for San Diego. And that's because we had a great harbor, but also because of this. Okay, right. So in the meantime, water still never really worked. Like I mentioned, the Flume Company ends up going belly up as well. By 1900, they're in foreclosure. They are in big trouble because there was a drought and they couldn't supply the water, and so they weren't getting any income, and they went under to their bondholders, right? So that's the money that's when Ed Fletcher got the money from Herb Murray to buy that up, rename it the Cuyamaca Water Company. And at the same time, the citrus thing never really hit because of this drought issues. We never took off the way you see in like Riverside or LA or Ventura County, where they were making millions. Some of the richest folks going on were citrus growers in this period. And so they decide to move, especially here in this drier area, into poultry. And so the area we now know as North La Mesa, Maryland Heights, this area around La Mesa Heights, West La Mesa, was known for about 30 years as Poultry Center. In fact, when Grossmont High School opens, and because this was unincorporated at the time, everybody from around here would have gone to Grossmont when it opened in 1922, actually had a state testing station, and they had kids studying poultry. And in 1927, they not only won the local small school football championship, but they won the poultry championship as well. So I'm just telling you, you got it balanced here, right? Sports and agriculture. Anyway.
Back to the water thing. Is
Yeah.
it because LA had done better negotiating for directing all the water to them, and we were just kind of on our own trying to solve it?
Yes, if you've ever heard of a guy named William Mulholland, who was very sneakily went into the Owens Valley and pretty much bought all the water rights. That was the first big pipe to come into LA, right? And then they'll eventually get the Northern Cal and they'll get the Colorado River, of which we then hooked into. So yeah, so they had that. They also got a little more rain because of the San Gabriels and the San Bernardinos and the San Jacintos sort of captured a little more than we have, a little bit higher peaks. So they did have a little more rain than us, not a ton more, but they were able to get water from other places that allowed them to take off. And of course, they would then be fueled by their second boom, which was petroleum, and their third, which was entertainment, which starts picking up, and we'll be talking about entertainment a little bit. In fact, we'll have our silent movie night at Mesa History Center in July. I'll let you know about that before we get out of here. But anyway, so in the meantime, so here we are. We come into the early 20s, still just pretty agricultural area, not a big tit. City of La Mesa's maybe 1,500 population, right? East San Diego's maybe 6,000 or so at this point, right? And so people are starting to look at it, and there's the Mesa Heights had their own Chamber of Commerce, which was pushing ag and roadside stuff, because in 1912, the other thing that happened was the state decided to call the Cajon Road the state highway. And by 1926, it's going to become the U.S. highway. So this was it. This was the cutting edge transportation thing right out here in front of us. This is how you got east and west in and out of San Diego through this, and it then gets paved and all kinds of things which we'll talk about. So you had Superior Heights, which is just on the other side of 67th, south of Tower. In fact, that's where the names Tower Street and Radio, which is now Jetson, come from. Tower Street comes from because what they could see from there was the naval towers. And so they wanted to use that as a little marking, hey, come by this because you can see the towers from there, right? And so this is about 1924. And Maryland Heights up in North La Mesa. Now, in the meantime, San Diego's starting to move east, and they're following the path that had been begun from the 1890s on in urban areas throughout the U.S., and that's the streetcar suburbs, right? Following the streetcars. And so streetcar went all the way up 30th, there was one up 5th, and then you had the lines that went down University into City Heights, and of course the one that went on Adams to Normal Heights, and eventually way outside of everything, Kensington Park, way out on the end of the world, right? Out there at the end, right? So those were sort of motivators, but was going on, right? And you can see that, and it helps those areas grow, right? And because there's a way for folks to get into town where the jobs are, get out to live in their lovely suburban house, out where it's a little bit of ground for you to till, to get away from the evils of the city, all that thing that was pushing suburban growth at this time. Now, of course, this is about the same time here, especially in California in the very little weather area, right? Automobiles were fantastic because you can use them year round, and they became very popular. And of course, that's going to change the way we can develop and the ability to move into areas that just because they're in this trolley line, you can still develop because of automobiles, right? And so you begin to see that move, right? And as I said, this is where the highway here becomes a big catalyst for this area. And in fact, originally, the original state highway, it actually went through what they call the Horseshoe Bend. You all know that's Amherst Street now, because there's a big canyon there. And I'll talk about that they'll fill that in when it becomes a federal highway. So we're not going to have people drive through that. We're going to fill that in and make it straight. And that's how it ended up being. So originally that was part of the road to get around this big deep canyon. They didn't want to pay to put a bridge in, so they just went around it, right? That the kids. Oh yeah, have you ever wondered why you see the shop and then you look down and go, wow, that's right? If you go up here on El Cajon. Right, so it's still a natural, they filled in the part for the road, but basically that most of it's still there. Right. So, of course, El Cajon Boulevard being named the U.S. highway becomes a big deal and pushes it. This is a part of the trying to connect folks to San Diego, to the rest of the U.S., commerce, population, all the things. And in the 1920s, we were having another real estate boom here in Southern California. Like I said, with L.A. was going crazy. So just to give you a difference in scale, in 1870, San Diego's population was 2,300. By 1920, it's going to be about 75,000. This is even after we do the exhibition, right? LA goes from about 10,000 in 1870 to 1 million in 1920, okay? So they took off. They could afford to build their own harbor. They did all the things right because they had citrus, petroleum, and this massive thing, entertainment, right? Movies. And it grew them, and then eventually they're gonna go into aerospace and all those things after the war as well. So they just had a bigger tent than we had at this point. But this is really important because the land along this road suddenly begins to get developed. And in the 20s, you begin to see these suburban tracts, even in El Cerrito, right? They're beginning to subdivide the old farm tracts into house lots, right? And in the meantime, the folks in East San Diego and La Mesa kept saying, you know, it'd be really great to connect ourselves with another route. Because basically, University pretty much ended at about Euclid. If you know, there's where the Egyptian Theater, and there's the lovely Silver Gate building, and there's the Tower Bar, right? There's a big canyon, we call Fox Canyon, right? So the trolley couldn't go down there. And eventually the highway was like, oh, we're gonna wait until 1925 when East San Diego and La Mesa worked together to get that paved directly from there and connect right about 54th into that road and pave that all the way in. So you had two things going on. You had this as the new US highway, you had suddenly they're gonna pave University Avenue to connect it all together, right? And this is where a couple guys who were interested in joining into the real estate boom, several of them from Los Angeles, a couple from San Diego, but mostly Los Angeles guys, come in and decide, there's these 550 acres that haven't seen much going on, this is our chance to join in the boom, right? So you're ready to talk about Rolando now. We got through all that pre-Rolando stuff, right? It's time to get to Rolando finally. Trust me, we'll get there, all right. Where you're gonna love to live. So go ahead and let's flip right into this, right? Now, as I said, this sort of fits perfectly to what was going on in Los Angeles as well. If you think about things like Wilshire Boulevard and Santa Monica and Western, and right, Suburbia was moving out. You were beginning to see then commercial hubs along Wilshire, the Miracle Mile. You were seeing the first department stores come out of downtown LA into suburbs like Hollywood and Pasadena. And you saw then the ability to have people live farther out because they still had the services they needed. They didn't always have to go downtown to get what they needed, right? And automobiles were the opening of this, right? And you begin to see things like Beverly Hills and Bellsville along these things, all along these. In fact, you follow Sunset all the way out to get out to Pacific Palisades, where I'm working on hopefully rebuilding Will Rogers State Historic Park, which I spent 20 years restoring and then burned a year and a half ago. But we're going to get there, right? And that's Pacific Palisades, one of the most amazing, beautiful communities. And then things like Westwood and around it, Bel Air and other things, right? So this has been proven, right? They are showing how this can work. And so the folks are looking at San Diego going, I think we can replicate some of this, right? Now, the other thing that's going on in subdivision and suburban development side are a couple of different things they use to control the value and ensure that the properties will be up to their standards for those subdivisions. And there's a couple different things. The first is architectural control. And they would put this into the deeds and into the sales agreements that you had to build a house that met our standards. In the case of something like Kensington Heights, they hired the noted architect Richard Recla, who was the king of Spanish colonial Mediterranean architect, to review. Thus, why he promoted that most of Kensington should be Spanish colonial, right? Because he was the provider to set a tone, right? So that's to ensure that people are building properties in the subdivision you want to buy in to keep the values up. Now, they also did this through what was called restricted development. So these are another things that started coming up in about the first decade. This idea of setting up that you had to spend so much money on your property. There would be setbacks. There would be, you couldn't build in front of, the garages needed to be the back. All those kinds of things that they would put on properties to make sure that the investment met the standards the developer wanted to have. Now, of course, this is also the Jim Crow era, right? When the Supreme Court was still saying separate was equal, it was equal. Right? So there also will be a lot of deed restrictions by the 20s that restrict you based on race or religion, that you either had to be Caucasian, and sometimes you had to be Caucasian and Christian to buy in a subdivision. Now, luckily, the Supreme Court in 1948 would throw that all out and find it unconstitutional. But in this period, those were still things that were happening. And so you just understand that context was there. And so if people will come up to me with their deeds, because of course it's illegal to change your title, and they will see these original documents and say, am I allowed to live in my, yes, you are today. That's been illegal a long time. But that's sort of the other side of controlling the restriction. And there's some other stuff, red line, I'll talk about later, but that was it. So like I said, some of those things were good in holding value and some were very discriminatory and not so good for everybody in the long run. The other thing about the 20s is just the hyperbolic marketing. This is just, you will just see and when we get into the ads for Rolando, they are part of that show, I'm telling you. Just going for it, man. This is the dream place. You got to live. You're going to have your dream castle, and it's going to be all perfect. And they just will sell this fun stuff, and we'll get into that a little bit. So these are sort of the other things that you think about when you think about 1920s development, all the way that control to try to create value and also keep value to both the developer as they're continuing to sell lots, builders to do more houses, et cetera, to have that standard. So you see that in San Diego and many places, right? Kensington is where I live, right? You see it in Point Loma, Mount Presidio Hills, and of course, the ultimate of sort of marketing. And if you saw that other show showed a picture of Mary Pickford, who was probably the most famous movie actress of the early 20s, right? Well, Talmadge was able to connect to the Talmadge sisters, right? So the developers that wanted to do Talmadge Park, and I'll be doing a talk on Kensington Talmadge in 1926 next month for them, they really pushed it, and it's both. So Norma Talmadge was a big star. Her sister Constance was a well-known actress, and then her third sister was married to a guy named Buster Keaton, probably the most talented Southern movie maker and comedian and out there in the 20s, right? And they all showed up to plant that first tree in January of 26 to get Talmadge Park going. And of course, there's all these fun stories. Oh, they never lived there. They never owned any lots there, but they were good for marketing, right? They're good for marketing. Just as now, there's some places like Fairbanks Ranch. And by the way, Mary Pickford was married to Douglas Fairbanks, who we're going to show one of his films at our silent movie night. So just see, I'm going to connect this all eventually for you. That is going to be fun. So you're seeing that San Diego was following the same patterns, and a lot of the developers came out of LA. All right, and you'll find that when we talk about Rolando. Right, so in the meantime, all that land is still sitting empty, right? And it had been held actually by a speculator since 1908 when he had picked it up. He didn't even live in San Diego, right? In fact, he's the guy who sold the land to the Navy in 1916 for the radio station. And finally, he partners up with another guy who lives in Oklahoma to just invest in the property because San Diego's starting to boom, right? And in early 26, a bunch of guys, about 3 or 4 guys from LA and a couple local guys, go to him and say, look, we want an option on this land. We are going to turn this into the city of Rolando. This is our chance. And of course, what are they going to push on? Let's go to the next one, right? In that it's between the 2 highways. It's going to be everything. And of course, it's going to have that, Rolando fits into that whole Spanish sort of marketing thing that San Diego was selling itself on after the exhibition. Really, San Diego is very interesting from that, in that you go to LA and you'll find all the various revival style houses throughout this period, 20s neighborhoods. San Diego really sort of bit in after the exhibition that our identity was that Spanish, Hispanic heritage, and therefore the Spanish Mediterranean style, promoted like guys like Richard Recqua and others, to push it as our style. So if you go to Kensington Park, it's 80% Spanish. In fact, our 1928 house, it's Spanish style, right? And so you'll see that was a big push. And so you begin to say, and so the name Rolando, which has nothing to do with Spain technically, but it sounded, right? It sounded kind of Spanish, even though it's a French myth, but we won't get into that part. So, and they have their first opening day on June 27th. So yes, we got our night spot. On June 27th, they decided to have what they call a Spanish barbecue. Haven't quite figured out exactly what they meant, other than it was a barbecue. But a Spanish barbecue, and they literally would have cars pick up at their real estate office downtown, drive people out here, so they'd have this entertainment. And this was at this point, there's nothing on the ground yet. They just got maps they filed with the county. There's just sagebrush. They brought them out and said, well, there'll be a lot over there. What do you think? What do you want to buy over there? Well, I'll have the free lunch first, thanks. But anyway, so they begin to catch us on. So the dancers, the whole thing, they're really going for it. Right? And so where does the name come from? And it's very clear. They say it right in their marketing in the first couple months. It's about rolling land. The rolling land, which of course it's a mesa with cut canyons, but why not? Rolling land. So rolling land was the name, and therefore Rolando, which fit in nicely. And so of course then they're going to follow up with a lot of street names named for Spanish places and things like that. So we'll get into that in a second here. In fact, the design is very interesting. In fact, it's a fairly well-known landscape architect who they hire out of LA. His name's Theodore Meier, the guy on the right there. He had done work in places like West LA and Beverly Hills and Bel Air, etc. So he had worked on these cutting edge sort of high-end subdivisions, right? And was very much into the idea of the, following the contours of the earth and not all straight grid streets, make it feel exclusive like they were having success in LA. He also was the one who figured out, with these canyons, it would be really great if I put pedestrian walkways between these steep streets so the neighbors can go visit each other and have to, instead of having to walk all the way around. And we actually have one of those subdivisions goes back to 1907 in La Mesa that everybody calls the secret stairs. They're not secret, they're public stairs. But anyway, I know you guys call them catwalks or pedestrian walkways. It's okay. You can call them whatever you want. But I understand they're pedestrian walkways. Catwalks are usually in theaters, but that's a different issue. So this is really, they are laying this out to be just as high-end as Kensington, Point Loma, La Jolla. They are expecting this to become a high-end. They've got the architectural restrictions. They have the deed all that to set up to make this a cutting-edge top, and perhaps with the 2 highways, maybe it'll be big enough if they put all 700 lots they originally subdivided to make it its own city. Could join in and become its own city, perhaps. So you begin seeing this marketing and the design. And that's why I say you'll see those walkways. And really, he talks all about that. And originally they had picked a set of eucalyptus trees for down Rolando Boulevard. We'll talk about it. They didn't make it through the 20s. We'll explain that. But anyway, so that's sort of, so this really was to be a cutting edge subdivision, right? The other thing you'll may notice about some of the lots is that everybody asks me, how come the sidewalks are so wide on the first block here in Rolando before they even put the little island in and everything, right? And there's alleys on those 2 blocks because they assumed, because the rest was on the highway, that you'd need some off-highway commercial lots. So they assumed that those lots were going to be for businesses. That's why they have alleys for deliveries and extra wide sidewalks, because they assumed they were going to be commercial lots. And as most commercial lots, if you ever look at lots in downtown and stuff where they're selling to businesses, they often would do as they did on University, make them very small lots so you could sell the business 3 or 4 lots, not just 1. Remember, the developer's making the most money from selling the land. They are then recommending contractors. They're not always making money out of the building at this point. It's very much they sell the lots, you find a contractor, or they recommend contractors. So there's just a lot of fun in selling that. The first year is by a guy named Shannon. We have a Shannon Street, right? And his manager, John Waybrad, and they both have wives named Lenore. Lenore. Oh, guess what? We got a Shannon Street and a Lenore Street, don't we? Right? Filled in a few of those lots. They're not all Spanish named, right? So there we go. Nope, we can go back one. We're good. There we go. right. So they're really promoting. So this is just in the first few months. Like I said, they haven't even got the grading teams out at this point, but they're pushing people. They're selling lots, they claim. They're going for it. They're going to make it, and this is the place to be. In between the two highways, the neck of the ball, everything's going to come through Rolando in the future. That's good. So the summer, fall, you begin to see this push, right? And the marketing just sort of goes nuts. Everybody is coming out, and we've seen photos in the papers of hundreds and thousands of visitors, which seems a little bit hyperbolic. Probably not quite that many. It's sort of like when everybody asked me about Mountain Helix Theater, the first show in 1925. They said, we had 8,000 people. I said, there's 1,200 seats. Maybe you've exaggerated just a little bit, but it's okay. But that's marketing, right? So anyway, and you begin, and they hired local marketing firms, and they really put on. So you will see their ads right next to Kensington and Talmadge and Point Loma and La Jolla and Coronado with the same sort of look, the same elements, that probably spending the same amount of money to market to sell folks way out here at Rolando. In fact, everybody, even Girl Scouts agree, as that photo mentioned. They came out to see it because Girl Scouts buy a lot of lots. Well, anyway, I don't know what's going to happen. But it's, tremendous profit. It's so vast, it thrills, right? That's the kind of fun we're having here, right? Even Abe Lincoln thinks Rolando is going to be great. Don't miss your chance to buy a lot out here in Rolando, right? And Shannon writes these fascinating testimonials that basically are these wonderful sort of shaggy dog stories that end up going, so you better buy a lot in Rolando. After he tells you some story about somebody who didn't invest properly and got fleeced. But if you buy in Rolando, you won't get fleeced. That's summarizing for what is, but he published these weekly in the newspaper, right? So there's simply no better investment, he will say, right? It's the answer to the riddle of it all, okay? In the meantime, they put on some shows. I'm going to tell you, right? I said about barbecues, luncheons, dancers, heck, even saw concerts. We don't hate those too much anymore. But we saw concerts, right? Kind of stuff, right? So, and a mystery show, come out, find out what your special prize was. Hop on the shuttle or drive on out to Rolando and find out what's going to make your life better, right? They had their own singing groups, including as well. In fact, the gals were so popular they even got on the radio, which was a pretty high thing in 1926, to go out, sing a little, and then promote. Wait, what are you singing for? What was singing for? The lovely new development in Rolando. You should go out and buy a lot, right? And so it's just part of the sort of over-the-top marketing, pushing hard, using the latest technologies to get people to want to come out and see the future here in Rolando, right? And even though we didn't have the Talmadge sisters, right? And by the way, Windsor Hills and La Mesa had Babe Ruth do a couple ads when he was out here for a baseball thing. He never owned a lot either. Me and Bill Swank looked everywhere, and he never owned anything out here, but he got his check, I'm sure, for taking his picture and has put his name next to it, right? But anyway, so Theodore Warfield was a actress at the Savoy Theater downtown. Remember, live theater was still one of the main ways you still had movies, but live theater was still a major part of entertainment. And so she had enough, shall we say, celebrity to come out and claim that she would build her house in Rolando too. Once again, searching, couldn't find her ever owning any lots or anything, but I'm sure she got something for coming out and lending her name and her picture to the show, right? So come on out and get out there. So the county approves all their plans. They sell their first set of assessment bonds to begin grading and paving. And then in the fall of 26, they began to bring both horse teams as well as grading machines, which was cutting edge, to start laying out the streets, starting with unit 1 and 2 up on the top. Okay, let's go next. Yep. Right? And of course, they're telling you they're going to build hundreds of houses. This is very important. They bring in an LA contractor who claims he's going to build 300 houses. As soon as they get all the lots sold, people are going to want those houses tomorrow to get out there and get going. So they're paving and developing. So they're pushing really hard on this. And the first house that actually does get built, interesting enough, is not Spanish. It's a Tudor revival over on what we now know as Aragon, but which was originally known as Campo Drive. And it's actually designed by a noted architect from Point Loma, E.H. Depew, who have actually researched some of his houses in other parts of the city. And he's the first one, and that's why it's the only one that isn't Spanish. But it is the one, and Mr. McLean will live there all through up until the 40s, and that's the first one. It's a little different, and you'll see it, but it's there on Campo. If you go down about 4,700, about halfway, you'll see the only Tudor revival. That's the first house to go up. In the meantime, they're planning about another 11 or 12 houses that they want to build, right? And by the end of 26, they've already started releasing Unit 2 for sale. This is sort of south of Salida, getting into it, but still mostly up on top. And you begin to see that, and they're advertising that they're also going to release Unit 3 for sale because they got the money in after selling all the bonds, and they're moving forward to put in the streets and the sewer and water lines and the street lights and all those things to go up here on that. Right. So as they end 1926, things are looking pretty good. They're claiming, we got hundreds of lots sold. We're going to start building hundreds of houses. This thing is rolling. You should be the next one to buy in. Right? Now, they do change. They're showing sort of a good public face, but there's a little bit of interesting things that will come up here in a minute. So you're getting the point at Christmas time that, hey, this is the best investment, best gift you can give yourself, buy a lot in Rolando, right? So they move into 27, and you begin to see the streets are coming in. They actually finally put a little building down on University because they've got the road cut all the way through so people can get into the subdivision from down there as well, right? But there is a change in that they decide to move Mr. Shannon out, or Mr. Shannon decides to move himself out of the business. He leaves the company and moves back to LA, right? So John Waybright sort of takes over. He had been the sort of sales manager before that, but they're still pushing, right? And they're knowing that they're going to make this happen. And so things are kind of moving along. The advertisements still kind of roll. They're not quite as over the top, but still very, very common, right? They still do a lot of fun things, like they offer to give away a lot at a St. Patrick's dance down in Pacific Beach at the brand new Mission Beach auditorium, right? And they're getting ready to do all this kind of fun stuff. They have Easter egg hunts for the kids. They're going to give away a pony. I mean, they're going all out, folks. They're not wasting any time. They're going all out to make this happen, right? So go ahead. Right? So 27 is looking pretty good still, right? There's only one thing inevitable. If you buy in Rolando, you'll be successful, right? That's all you needed to know. Let's go on to the next one. And we then begin to see the other 11 houses that are going to build in the 20s, all Spanish style, interesting enough, all along Rolando and what's now Aragon. And you probably can recognize most of them if you go, the ones that look from the 20s, the Spanish ones, and those along with Mr. McLean's house there up over at. And so you begin to see that. So there's some promise, hey, some houses are coming out of the ground. Things look like we might be doing okay. Right? In fact, they get so excited because this is about the time the city is sort of buying into the aircraft age, and they're trying to figure out, where are we going to put the Civic Airport, right? Remember where the airport now was pretty much just mud flats, right? They just built the Naval Training Center and the Marine Recruit Depot. Pretty much everything on the other side of those things was just mud flat and bay. So where are they going to put this thing? Eventually they're going to put it there, but Rolando says, hey, we have some land south of University. We'll put the airport right down there for you. Free land, we'll give it to you. Put the airport right here. Sounds good, right? In fact, they decide to utilize the wonderful world of technology, right? The airplane, and they actually have a guy do a stunt parachute jump out of this plane to promote what's going on and come to Rolando. Look at all the excitement we're having down here in Rolando. And it was some kind of dual shoot thing or something, and he made it. He made it. It's a good sign. We figured out he had survived. But that's the kind of stuff they're doing to just try to draw attention and get things going, right? And of course, they're continuing to put the improvements in. They're rolling through. They're finishing up. Unit 3 pretty much takes us all the way down to University on the sort of east side and leaves us only Unit 4 and 5, which is that sort of leg of the J on the map there. And so by 27, they're pretty much got most of that all in, and they're selling that, and they're building some houses. Looks like it's going to be okay, right? And there's a few pictures of there's the first shot of our little park, little island, right? Sort of with this curb there. You begin to see some of the houses going in. You see people coming out in the summer, things happening as the houses are sort of being filled in and the lots that go with it, right? And in fact, in fall of 27, they get approval from the county to go ahead and do the improvements on Units 4 and 5, which takes you out sort of towards Bonillo and eventually to Cartagena along University out there. And so those go in at about that time, and things are looking pretty good. They get the money from selling those improvement bonds, and they begin to move forward. Now, I mentioned improvement bonds. This is going to be something that's going to be a little bit of a problem, okay? Because what had passed was a state law called the Mattoon Act. And whether you were doing this for water bonds or street or whatever improvements, it had this little thing, and that the Mattoon Act was set up originally to put improvements into already existing subdivisions. So basically it said was all the improved lots in a subdivision will pick up, or an improvement district, would pick up the unimproved lots assessments. Okay, so at this point, Rolando's going to have about 712 lots, and it's got 12 houses. There's some trouble coming. But in the meantime, if you want to look what it looked like in November 27, there's that old town site I was telling you about, right? 67th to 73rd Street now along the highway, right? And they're just they're filling in to put the cutoff so that Amherst is going to become Amherst, right? You see the first 3 units are graded and ready to roll. You can start to see some of the little houses are popping up here. I know it's a little fuzzy, but you get a jive of where we were in late 27, right? Here's a little close-up looking more directly south. There they're fill in, right? The horseshoe bend cutoff. You're seeing the island. You're seeing the houses going in, and then paving and grading all the streets down below. Right, just another shot looking sort of more from the east toward the west to see it from a different angle. Another one, this is from Rolando Park, sort of looking north. You can see how they're finally made it to university, and they're getting ready to put those units 4 and 5 over here in the next few months, right? So just to give you an idea, and I mentioned that Seminole Drive and Catoctin, those go back to that La Mesa Colony subdivision map of 1887, right? Those roads are way back, right? And so that's sort of outside of where Rolando is, and that would just be on the other side there. So we can go there and give you an idea, right? So what's going on the highway at this point? Not much. Over in Art Giacassioli's little subdivision over Acacia Park, and that's Art Street, Art Giacassioli, right? He puts a little office building and a little couple of business buildings there out here in the middle of nowhere, right? And they have a little nursery there, assuming that people are going to start buying up plants for all their new houses, and it's going to sit out here. It's a nice country area where he doesn't have to worry about people worried about growing plants out next door or whatever, right? Now, so what does that lead me to is the folks, and this is a part where a lot of the owners realize with the developers that they got a little problem coming, because in about a year, they're going to owe about 700 lots worth of assessments, right? So who wants to be number 13? Not too many folks, right? And this one. So one of those investors is a guy named George Blake. He's from Detroit, Michigan, and he looks and goes, uh-oh, we got to revamp this and try to get people going here. The problem for poor George is that boom I was talking about, it actually starts slowing down in late 27, and in 28 it's going to slow too. Now, of course, the crash in 29 will completely blow out the whole economy of both the US and the planet, pretty much. But at this point, you're beginning to see a slowing, so that doesn't help the sales either. But George comes in all out. In fact, he renames Rolando the world's master development, right? And he's going to put about a 6-month campaign together to try to reinvigorate people to buy in and come on, guys, build these houses. Let's get this thing going. We're going to make this work, right? The world's master development. So, and this is my favorite ad of all time, right? The eyes of the world are on San Diego, but the eyes of San Diego are on Rolando with 12 houses, 700 lots. But when I say over the top marketing, there we go, right? I mean, just throw it out there, right? See what happens, right? And so I have to give you an idea. So the eyes of the world are on Rolando. Of course, and they make a few offers, including things like, hey, we're still open for that airport. And the next one, come on, don't worry, we're still making it work. It's going, we're going to be okay. And the other thing they offer up, remember they were offering the airport to those, well, they end up offering State College, that same area, which is now Rolando Park as well. And because San Diego State College realized about 1920 that didn't have enough room in University Heights, right, where the original site was. And they needed a bigger spot. And they looked at Balboa Park, no, nobody wanted that. And then they looked at PB, no, that wasn't. Then they looked at Encanto. And so they took about 3 shots until 1928 was their 4th chance, and they took up offers again. Who can give us property to make this work, right? And so, of course, George Blake decides, sure. And so he brings Theodore Meier back and has him lay out the campus that would be where Rolando Park is, right? Full with the football stadium and the whole thing, right? Now remember, Meier had just helped Alfonso Bell decide Bel Air next to the new UCLA campus, right? So, and he knew all those guys. He knew what he's doing. So he does this, and they throw their lot in along with another, where Helix High and Eastridge, that was offered by Fletcher and the Murray Trust. That was offered up as well. But mentioning where it's ended up happening was, the next one, was that Alfonso Bell, in the meantime, had taken an option out on the Waring property, which today we would call everything from Allied Gardens through San Carlos. About 7,000 acres. Never lived here, Waring, but he owned it absentee. And Alfonso Bell came in and said, oh, State College is looking for something, huh? He takes an option out, offers 300 acres on what he called the Mission Palisades, right? We know it as Montezuma Mesa, and then said, I'm going to build the same kind of Bel Air neighborhood surrounding this campus. I'm going to put country clubs down in the canyon that is Alvarado Canyon Creek. He's going to build country clubs. He's going to dam the creek and make a lake. He's going to turn this into the new Bel Air, Westwood, surrounding your campus. San Diego State said, that's the one. We're taking that land, right? Now, unfortunately for probably San Diego State, though, and perhaps more Mr. Bell. In 1928, he was doing great. By 1931, as the campus opens, he files for bankruptcy. He'd lost most of his wealth in Palisades, Bel Air, all that. And so it doesn't happen. We don't get all that around. If you go up College Avenue, you'll see some nice little 30s revival houses from about Pontiac Cressida there for about a block. That's what they were going to do all the way around the campus. That's as far as it got. His partner was able to do a few things, but they never did the full-on what they were expecting to do. But states had said, well, we're going with the guy who knew how to do this, and it ended up not working. But anyway, so that's how State College gets out here, which of course then triggers all the property north of El Cajon Boulevard, including the town site, to be annexed into San Diego along with the new State College site. So basically, this is the point where El Cerrito and everything north up through the town site, but not Rolando, gets annexed into the city of San Diego, because I suspect the city looked and went, ooh, these guys have a few debts coming up. Right, and that's also why we got this weird boundary. You can go to the next one. Why certain lots on the periphery were allowed to decide if they wanted to go to the city or go to La Mesa or stay unincorporated like Rolando would end up being. So Rolando's going to stay unincorporated, and we'll talk about this until the 50s, but that basically is why the boundary sort of went that way, leaving pretty much Rolando out in the county still at this point. Right. So the ads for Mr. Blake stop in June of 28. They're in big trouble. There are pages and pages of assessments due showing up in the newspapers, and basically by late 29, it's going to be in foreclosure. In fact, the real estate company misses their payroll. They have to go to court to pay off their people, and then they lay them all off. It's starting to hit the downward spin. So they give it one more chance. A couple of the owners try to create a new holding company to try to get together, try to get some loans to be at least buy off for some time. But of course, as you might guess, with the Depression looming and things slowing down, they are unable to do that. And of course, they end up hiring a former salesman from the Kensington Park, Talmadge Park Company, to come out, and he tells, oh, don't worry, we're not really part of the Mattoon Act. Don't worry, it's okay, we're gonna be fine, we're gonna be fine. Unfortunately, he wasn't being honest. They were gonna be in big trouble, and as we go to the next one, even though you can see that they've got units 4 and 5 now all graded, and they had to pay off Mr. Daly to do all that, and they had to sort of buck up how much cash they had to get him paid off as the court forced them to. They're going to be in foreclosure here real quick. But you can see unit 4 and 5 are in, and you can see that because of the property line, at that point, Laco Drive just stops because of somebody else's property on the other side there. Arundo would be the same. It just stops at the boundary of the property at this time. And so even though they claimed it was all, in fact, not going to be true, that they weren't part of the Mattoon Act, they ended up being one of about 45 subdivisions without the county that's going to be in full foreclosure to the state by 1930. And it's going to take the county pretty much all of the 30s to figure out a way to raise funds to buy out those bonds, to reopen those properties for development. Because not only when they're in foreclosure to the state, does the state not get their money, but the county doesn't get any money when a property's in foreclosure, right? And so they were also seeing this was going to be a big problem that they needed to fix at some point. So, right. So, okay. There's the 20 story. Where are we? My gosh, and we got a late start. There we go. You want me to end it at a cliffhanger? Who's going to come and save Rolando? Is it going to be Flash Gordon? Is it going to be Hopalong Cassie? Who's going to save Rolando from this fate? They're in foreclosure, for gosh sake. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? I can get you at least up through the Rolando Village. Let's go for that. Let's go to the PDF, the next PDF. PDF B. So how you doing? All right? Any quick questions? Any questions? Anybody got quick questions while we're up into the next one? Yeah.
All of these advertisements, was Rolando a well-known name in outside of San Diego? They're like, what is this place?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't know outside. I mean, outside, I suspect in San Diego definitely. A lot of the ads were like the banking companies and the investment or Chamber of Commerce. They are really saying, you will see that the ad will say, look at the new places like Kensington Park and Talmadge and Rolando and Point Loma Estates. I mean, they were listed as, they were being promoted just like everybody else as a place that, San Diego is considered to live, and that this is going to help San Diego grow. Because the assumption was, just as happened, what I mentioned is East San Diego annexes in 1923. Normal Heights will annex in 1926 into the city, right? And so there was a lot of growth. La Mesa had come all the way up to what we now call 70th. And so they were looking at thinking, okay, at some point these areas are going to come in, be part of the city, and that's going to help grow the metropolitan area and be successful. So I want to go ahead. All right. So how do we get revived and get at least up to the war? Let's go, right? So like I said, basically the county's going to be stuck. There's about 40 districts, including places like Fletcher Hills. In fact, Mr. Fletcher nearly lost everything. He said he was so desperate he ended up running to become a state senator. So he had to go into politics. That's how desperate he got, okay? Nothing against our politicians. All right, but anyway, he went into the political world after being in the development world for a long time. So you've got those sort of things going. So it's going to take them quite a while. And in fact, the assumption was that at one point, the subdivision owed $244,000 in assessments. And remember, this is 1930 money, right? This is a lot of money, right? And so they begin to sort of figure things out. And by 1935, 36, the county is able to get a bond passed to buy out Mattoon Act and assessment bonds, right? And they get the voters to say this, and then they start negotiating with the bondholders for pennies on the dollar buyouts, saying, look, we got to get this stuff back on the tax roll. And especially by 1938, 39, what's going to happen is we had just brought in consolidated aircraft from Buffalo in 1935, and we were joining the aircraft sort of production. We still had solar and a couple other small companies. Ryan Aircraft, who had built the Spirit of St. Louis for Lindbergh, right? So they're pushing this, and we begin to get a lot of contracts to build military planes, which is going to come in to why San Diego is going to take off right before the war. No pun intended on that, by the way. But so they're buying into this to say, we got to get this up because we need these places to build homes and develop the community. So if you looked at a map circa 1935, you can see all the streets are sitting there with the 12 houses, but that's about it. And it sort of sat in between San Diego and Mesa, and there were some other subdivisions from the late 20s still around. Some were fine, and some, like El Cerrito, never got into those assessment problems. And so when the campus opened in 31, it's one of the first places you see people building houses. So because they're close to the campus, we see a lot of professors moving to Talmadge, Kensington, El Cerrito, because they want to be close to campus, that kind of thing, as well as other civic and community leaders, et cetera. Go on. And so you can see there are the streets out there. It's about 1935. There's the new campus, sort of sitting way out there at the end of College Avenue. It didn't go past the campus at that point, didn't go down in. There's no highway yet in the canyon or anything, right? So you're beginning to see this sort of development thing, right? And the campus is going to open in 1931. In the meantime, of course, El Cajon Blvd is considered a key thoroughfare for commerce and business. And you're going to see it developing more as well and filling in all the way along. And even as far out here as 70th and El Cajon, which is that photo from about 1940. Right. Now, and what's going to help this out and come out of the Depression is a thing called the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. And what they do is an attempt to sort of get things moving in the economy. They want to make sure people can start to build housing, knowing that people need places to live. They also know that people need jobs to build houses, that stimulates the economy, et cetera. So what happens is the federal government tells the banks, we will guarantee mortgages. Up to this point, a mortgage was a pretty risky loan for a bank, right? Because a lot of bad things can happen, right? Contractor runs away with the money, they don't finish the house, and then the bank's stuck with an unfinished property that doesn't have much value. So it was a risky thing. So you usually had to have collateral to get a mortgage before the FHA, when the federal government says, hey, banks, we will guarantee those mortgages to keep things, because we want to get things moving, right? So that really opens the housing market. So pretty much now, if you have a job in the 1930s, you're probably qualified to get a mortgage. You didn't have to have all that collateral to be able to get your house built, take a loan out. So this really opens the market very much to the blue-collar working folks to get that American dream and own your own house. So that thing. Now, at the same time, there was a little problem in trying to figure out how to make sure those were guaranteed loans and how much the federal government should give to certain areas. They used this little real estate thing called redlining. And what redlining did was set a set of criterion of how much a bank would put into a loan for different areas. And so there were areas that were higher end, the red, the blue, and the yellow areas. And then the areas that were the redlined were what they considered to be the lower, higher risk zones. And also because, as I mentioned, the Jim Crow sort of legacy going on, which meant usually communities of color were in the red zones. And so it was harder for them to get money to invest, and it would create some legacy over time. And luckily in the 1960s, they would make all that illegal through the Fair Housing Acts and everything. But there were some of those. So that's the other sort of side of the FHA is it instituted redlining. And so places like Southeast were redlined, places like Kensington were high-end, La Jolla, and other places like City Heights were sort of mid-range, right? So those are just other pieces of all that people always ask me, well, what's redlining? Now, it's not deed restrictions. It's a different kind of discrimination. And it would take the 60s, the Civil Rights Act, the state housing laws, and the federal housing laws. And if you've ever bought a property and they made you sign all the things, did anybody not give you a loan? Did anybody tell you couldn't have a loan? That all comes from the legislation in the 60s. And one of the things I always like to remind people, it asked me, hey, I heard John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King came and talked at San Diego State in 1963. Two of the reasons they were asked to come out by Governor Brown, the first Governor Brown, was to speak about the state's housing laws. They were trying to break through that. It was right about the time of the Civil Rights Act, and they were pushing these fair housing acts. So that's another reason why we have sort of these connections to understand, why did they come out to San Diego State suddenly, two big heavyweights like that? Because the governor said, I need you to come out and help us push the Housing Act. So let's go on here, right? So in the meantime, so this bunch of guys come back up and decide to pick up and buy out the bonds for Rolando, right? Buy out all the 5 lots and begin a settlement. And it's going to clear in about February, March of 1939 to clear so they can begin to resell the lots and start building houses. Yeah. And so that's when we get the Rolando Village Company. So to distinct themselves away from the unfortunate situation of Rolando, they decide to rename the subdivision Rolando Village, to give it a set aside and sort of pick it up and give it a new face. And so they have this, and I actually was finally able to get a copy. That is the brochure cover that they would hand. You went into their real estate office, they would hand you the brochure, and you could flip through there. And of course, they had FHA loan terms. They could get you in a house. And this, as I said, is right when San Diego is booming. 1939 to 1943, the city of San Diego's population is going to double in 4 years. It's going to go from 200,000 to 400,000 in 4 years. It's often called the boomerang boom. It's pushed by the growth of the military bases here, prepping for World War I, the aircraft companies building planes to sell first to Britain and then for the U.S. effort. And so you're beginning to see this massive growth in San Diego. And so here was a bunch of lots ready for houses, right? Well, we got a flood out there? Okay, well, that's good. There's a chance to build a bunch of houses, right? Because here's a bunch of streets ready for housing. So this was really popular. So in March of 39, the Rolando Village Company opens up and begins to sell. You could buy a lot for as low as $500. They gave you your basic, usually it was about a $30 mortgage, but remember you only made about $100 a month. Usually 10-year 1% loans, that were the early FHAs. Whew, you missed those. And so really was sort of pushing, and it begins to bring that into Rolando. Interesting enough, Joe Levico, who was the third partner, had been a sales associate in the 20s. He ended up moving. He lived in La Mesa. He later becomes a water district manager, very important guy. And he's, along with these two other real estate guys, Margolis and Harry Arthur, are going to be the ones who push the market to sell the lots here in Rolando. And as you see, this is very 1930s sort of marketing. The Americana styles of the minimal traditional homes. These are pretty much little boxes with a little bit of trim on them because they're very much shooting for that entry-level folks just to get in. People need a house to live. Most of them, as you'll note, as you probably know, are 2-bedroom, 1 baths, often 3-bed. Maybe our big one, our 1,000 square footer was a 3-1. Back, at our house, right? But a lot of them still small because people just needed a place. This is also pre-television, so there isn't that family/TV room. And it's before sort of everybody in the market demanded that second bathroom, which is very helpful in the baby boom. Right, so they offer full services. They had everybody lined up, not only contractors they would recommend, but also furniture, electricians, whatever you wanted. Hey, they had a list of folks they would recommend. So you would buy the lot, usually from the Rolando Village Company. They'd give you the suggested list of contractors. The contractors would also buy up lots, maybe build one house spec up so you could see their work, and then offer you their plan book. Hey, why? And that's why we have still, it sort of feels custom, even though these are very small houses, and a lot of El Cerritos filling in the same time, the same way, even parts of Talmadge and Point Loma. You're seeing the same houses, the same contractors building the same houses throughout the county. So you'll find a lot of these small, minimal traditional houses, not just here, but throughout the county. And so here's some of those names we may have run across as you were looking through our books at the street fair, right? Denstead companies were 2 of the largest. A couple of the sons lived here. A couple lived in Kensington, a couple all throughout the place. And they were building all through. And they were probably the two largest builders in this pre-war into the war period for Rolando Village. And of course, they would, like I said, model houses, and you get these wonderful articles. It's fun when we find one. They look sort of like articles, but they're really ads trying to tell you to buy and build with this builder, right? And it's very much, if you've ever seen the movie Mr. Bindings Builds His Dream House, where Myrna Loy is sitting there saying, well, I want Robin's A blue, and I want, all that. That's the way these read. Oh, well, the floral patterns against the stripes and that kind of stuff. So it's fun stuff. The fashion of the time. And of course, some were more custom. Some guys like Edward Caballero, and this is the house on Lenore. You may have walked past this house on Lenore and go, why is the front room on an angle? It was designed that way. It was not somebody coming in later. He did that to just sort of catch attention that he could build unique houses. It's hard to sort of see it, but the front room isn't square to the street, it's actually on an angle. And if you wander past Lenore on the 47th block, you'll see the house and go, oh, that's why. And Caballero did 5 or 6 very unique style houses, a little tweak sort of on all of them. And of course, this is probably about March, April of 39, and you see they needed to do something about the weeds. They hadn't got them all figured out. They also, all those eucalyptus trees didn't make it, so they replaced them all with silk oaks along Rolando Boulevard. And that's why we have those wonderful trees on there. And they begin to see dozens of houses starting to be put up at this first year or so. In fact, go ahead to the next one. By a year in, they're pretty much saying they've got about 100 or so houses already built and are just moving to keep selling because, like I said, the city's booming. People are looking for places to live. They're coming out here either to work for the military or to build planes or whatever, which were drawing a lot of attention. And so they need a place to live. And the first commercial buildings, though, of course, end up on El Cajon Boulevard, and there's pieces of that underneath those buildings right around the corner up here, or this way, or this, right? And by a year in, they're talking 132 houses they believe had already been built, and they had another 100 at least going, ready to go. So as you begin to see in March of 40, you're beginning to see that first unit especially starting to fill in, a few going down on second unit, but pretty much they're starting with all those nice, flat, easy to build lots first up on top. So another shot sort of looking the other direction, you can sort of see a little closer, houses going in. That's Salida Tower there. And of course, there's still nothing out here. We're sitting on a ranch. There's an old ranch house that would just been right up over here, and there's nothing else on Seminole at this point. Another shot, so you can see the island, you can see the true trees going in. Another shot sort of looking north. Again, to see that and the walkways and all that good stuff, right? So by year end, things are starting to happen. And of course, that's going to get, and through the next year, they're estimating that they have about 400 of the lots filled by end of 1941. And so as you see, even in March, you're beginning to see houses start to head down the hill, houses on the flat lots along what's now Malcolm Rolando was originally the name, and then they made it Madrid, and then later had to change it to Malcolm. But you can see those starting, where the steeper lots, the canyon lots are going to hold out till later. But just a couple other shots, you could sort of look down University, or looking up, these a little higher level, but you could sort of see the streets still in there. Seminole sort of off on its own there. Somebody stuck a little dirt connector from Seminole into the subdivision over there.
What are those circles over there at the top?
Generally, when you're seeing circles, those are orchards, the trees. Yeah, most of this poultry stuff was over on the La Mesa side. It was this way. And by 40, most of those farms are heading out farther east. They're getting out of here. Land's too valuable to sell for other things. Now, of course, the war kicks in, and that's going to slow building, though it's also going to sort of set up these guys to learn how to do prefabricated tract housing. Because after the war is when the tract housing comes in. And what really key is that because of the defense building and the need to build housing and defense bases and stuff fast, they were all sort of taught how to use prefabrication of, okay, we're going to come in, and in fact, they changed in early 42. They told contractors, we're not giving you material for single houses. You need to be building at least half a dozen houses, or we're not going to give you anything, because we need to be denting this housing need. We not just want one-offs. And so it sort of pushes them to move and partner up with other guys, and they learn how to, okay, we'll put all the foundations in, then we'll bring the framers, then we'll be the MEPs, and they learn how to sort of do that so that after the war, when the financing changes to meet that demand after the war for housing, and the federal government says, we'll fund an entire subdivision, you build it, then you pay us as you sell it, that's tract housing, right? But they had learned how to do that, a lot of them, either building defense housing or building defense factories or in housing during the war where they're saying, yeah, we're not letting you just do one-offs. You need to come in here and dent this housing problem, or we're not giving you materials, right? So that's really going to change which will bring in the tracts. right? So here's an example that Denstead, I think most of the south couple blocks of Alamo was all done under 1 or 2 permits. You'll see the same thing along Tarragona and Malcolm, where they came in and one builder built about 20 houses in about a year, right? And so there's a lot of garage left, garage right, which is the kind of thing you're going to see in the post-war tract, especially entry level, to just kind of get housing up, to get people some shelter, right? So, I mean, I could finish it off, or I could come back. I don't know. What do you guys want? What do you think? It's the shortest section, but I'll let you decide. You want to know how we get to today? I know some of you have to get to sleep. You bet. Thanks a lot. Are you gung-ho if we go for it? We just go for it? All right, let's do it. There's about 20 more, I think. It's not going to all be so. So by 1946, you can see most of the upper area is filled in, and there's all the undeveloped area that's going to suddenly be open to these developers who are now ready to start building in tracts. Right? So if we look in 1946, you can see still nothing on the other side. Salida just goes into a dirt road to connect to Seminole. The little blue stars where we are right now standing. The building's not here yet. Right? So you just get a feel of, right? There we go. And on the corner was the furniture store. There, that's where would now be Aragon and El Cajon. It was originally the Robins Furniture. And we'll get into that in a bit. Right. And so what's going to allow San Diego then to really take off is, after that huge growth in the war, the Defense Department basically said, look, you guys need to hook into the metropolitan water system because you can't run out of water. We got like 12 bases now. We got the aircraft industries. We can't have you guys running out of water. And that's when San Diego had to connect in, and that's where the water now comes to San Vicente and then makes its way to the filter plant here at Alvarado, et cetera, that allows San Diego to then take off, right? The estimation that natural sources, the population San Diego could probably handle would be about 400,000 people total for the county, right? Now, we have 3.7 million or something, right? Because there's those big pipes. There's no way we could supply that local water source without that additional water coming in. Same with LA. LA couldn't be 20 million people without all that water coming from everywhere else, right? So this is key to allow this to happen. So in the meantime, you've got this community that's been built. You're sitting in unincorporated land between San Diego and between La Mesa. And so the question is, which way should we go? What are we going to do? Right? We need those services, right? Maybe we should become our own city, right? They're thinking about this. So in the late 40s, you're beginning to sort of see these questions. Well, who's going to pay for that? We don't really have a decent sewer system. Do we connect to the city? San Diego has a better sewer system, but we've had the school district from La Mesa. Oh, what are we going to do? It was sort of pulling at it for a while. In the meantime, the Mesa Spring Valley School District opens up the Rolando School just down the road here, still in the unincorporated area at that point, and allows then kids in the unincorporated to be able to go to that school. Right? They're going to do the same thing in 1951 with a place called Rolando Park School. Get that in a second, right? In the meantime, they need some civic space. They have local architect Sam Hemmel design them a little building that they want to put down, and it's basically about where we know the ball fields are for Rolando Little League. That's where they wanted to put it. So they hold a carnival in 1947 here. So the street fair has some going back ways, right, to this, up raising money to build this. La Mesa was doing the same thing. They were trying to build a war memorial building. Now, of course, La Mesa never got that built, and Rolando never got this one built either. In 1948, all of that was canceled. Summer 48 was the worst part of the polio epidemic here in San Diego County, and all kids' programs were canceled that summer, and they said, you shouldn't hold the carnival. We didn't want to spread polio, right? So just so we've had our pandemic issues in the past too, right? So just so to give you an idea, but it's fun, and Claire Tell she's on the right there, she gave us that photograph some time ago. Her dad was a builder here in the area. So she was part of the courts from the carnival in 47, right? And it was going to be over there where eventually, not even in the city of San Diego, it ends up in the city of La Mesa, and is where the Little League field, and it's now Rolando Park of La Mesa, not Rolando Park, the neighborhood of San Diego. Oh, and this little thing sort of gets built as well. We need a decent church and meeting room, and eventually this hall as well added over time. So established in 41 and then built up in 51, this building. In the meantime, of course, the Rolando Village Company realized they don't want to just build in Rolando, so they changed their name to Lincoln Homes, realizing they wanted to build in Chula Vista and Vista La Mesa, that called the Rolando Village Company wouldn't be particularly strong for their marketing. So they ended up changing their name. They continue to build housing and sell lots and do real estate beyond this. And of course, like I said, you begin to also see the change in style of houses after the war. You begin to see, as the baby booms come in, the people are needing not only a second bathroom that they all know because they're going to have a nice batch of kids, but this idea of this newfangled thing that's going to kick in when we get our first TV station in 1948, which is the television or the family room, right? not the parlor for former things, but the place to hang out with the kids and watch this crazy little black and white thing that used to be about that big probably, to watch Ed Sullivan or whoever, right? So in the meantime, you begin to see the contractors coming in, recognizing Chris Cosgrove is one of those interesting guys. He had been building custom homes since the 20s. He actually lived in a very nice home north of us in Kensington. It's on the historical register now. And he's the guy who's going to do a lot of entry-level stuff. He's going to build those little dinky houses along College Avenue as we go there, as well as the edge of Tarragona. You'll see the very little small house. He's doing that kind of level stuff, as well as building custom houses in Kensington, right? But he's also then going to be one of the main builders of Rolando Park. And what's interesting, from 1949 to about 1952, Rolando Park and Redwood Village are going to be actually the first all-tract neighborhoods to be developed in San Diego. There were no other. They were all tract housing. And those are the first two neighborhoods. Now, of course, gives Claremont the big, because that was the full thing with shopping centers and all that, right? Followed by Allied Gardens. But this was the first neighborhoods that you say, those are all tract houses. You'll see the same thing in Oak Park, parts of Webster, and sort of South City Heights. But the neighborhoods are going in all tract housing, right? And so he's part of that. And his wife's name was Celia. Anybody go down to Rolando Park and you'll see Celia Vista Drive. And her father, I just researched this house, was the head of customs for Baja California. Her brother ended up being the head of the Power and Water Company and the head of the the head of the lighting company, every stuff down in Baja. They lived on this side though, from about 1910 on. They always lived on this side. He ended up getting the some other interesting things. So fun. That's Celia. So anyway, so there's just, you can see those kind of houses. You may recognize a lot of them been updated over the years and expanding stuff. But these very entry level, $7,000. That's still pretty low after the war for attractiveness. The houses in the 1939-40, mostly about $3,000. Your house probably cost about $3,000 to build. These ones were pushing big $7,000, right? So be careful. Which is about what most of the houses of Redwood Village went for, about 7 to 8. So you begin to see then this east area become part of the housing boom, right, after the war. Got to have housing. Tract housing is going to help fill the need, right? And then finally in January of 50, since there was no country club down the middle of Alvarado Canyon, they pushed the Caltrans pushes the highway through all the way to La Mesa. By 52, they'll punch it over the hill into El Cajon, and that's eventually going to morph into the full US 80 and eventually the Interstate 8, right? And so, but that really opens up and is going to open up all our friends to the north side of Alvarado Canyon. 53, it's going to be Allied Gardens. 55, Del Cerro. 59, San Carlos, as well as all the North La Mesa, almost all tract housing, right? Meaning that demand for housing. So if we look about 1958, you can sort of see, looking east, we're here, the village down here. You can see pretty solid, other than they haven't filled in the spot where Montezuma School is just getting built on this side over here. You can barely see it, which is now the Language Academy, right? And out to all these other tracts that are filling in a lot of these old farm rural areas, right? And they're setting pace. They're building out. So there's Allied Gardens up on the top there, right? Lake Park is North La Mesa, etc. And so then the west side of La Mesa, though those empty, also begin to fill in with smaller tracts like Denstead Heights and Parkman Estates, etc., Russell Heights, to help fill in that gap between the brand new College Avenue is paved south of El Cajon in 1947, takes it all the way down to what will become 94 and connecting Lemon Grove. But up to that, it didn't go south of El Cajon until 47. So that also helps open up these tracks, right? And then you can see this is sort of the south end of El Cerrito. There's what will become Valley View Hospital there, sitting at that point down here on the corner of where that's University and 54th today, down here on the side end, right? So we get to see these tracks fill in our west side, right? And that was from anywhere from 4950, Jackson and Scott, Seminole Terrace, all the way up into the early 60s, such as some of these other little subdivisions that sort of fill in. So as you see the 55, you're beginning to see these tracks sort of filling in up to College Avenue, the filling in of El Cerrito South End, the Bellevue Heights, and the grading for what will become the shopping center, eventually known as Bellevue Shopping Center originally, and where they'd have the movie theater, and now it's the Food for Less and all that, right? That's just getting in. And Redwood Village, they're putting up, and those houses, they built about 700-800 houses in Redwood Village in about a year and a half. So really quickly got them up. So just to give you an idea, and of course some other fun things. We had our campus drive-in that was open in 1948. We had the first Jack in the Box at the corner of 63rd and El Cajon right up here. Mr. Peterson decided to get Russell Forster, the architect, to figure out a machine for dispensing burgers. Just drive your car up and grab them and go, right? And that was a really cutting edge thing. And just sort of you could see as the suburbia is sort of filling in, and Rolando is going to fill in with all of the post-war stuff, right? And so as you see that, and of course to the south, and I have a whole talk for Rolando Park, it has its own story. Like I said, one of the first all tract neighborhoods along with Redwood Village that just sort of takes it, fills it all in. And the fun story, we'll get into the annex here next, but you get a sort of feel. And so you could see even by mid-50s, the houses are all going in, right? And a lot of garage, left garage, very entry level, a little higher end in Rolando Park than Redwood Village, but filling in. Now, once again, which way to go? The questions put to the test. And one of the things that posted was there was a fire at the furniture store. And so that sort of triggered everybody to go, wait. They had to wait for the fire truck, instead of the fire station around College to respond because they didn't get a call from the county. They had to call the county to call the CDF truck to come out here. And of course, by the time I got here, the building had been pretty much lost. This is going to happen in Kensington too, by the way, about 2 years later. And because they had stayed out, the original subdivision stayed out. And they said, we can't deal with this. We got to figure out one way there. We're either going to go to the city of Mesa or we got to go the city of San Diego. And they also were dealing with sewer issues and other things. And in March of '54, they go ahead and decide, well, it probably makes more sense to go to city of San Diego because they got the sewer system. They weren't technically in the irrigation district boundary, which made it hard for Mesa to have annexed them, even though they had been getting their water from them from day one. And so they decided, yeah, we're going to do, but we don't want to go into the city schools. We really like Rolando Park and Rolando Elementary. And of course, it doesn't work that way, as the school district would explain to them. And so basically, the city said, look, you can't do that. You're not paying into the tax base for the city you live. You've got to pay in, so you need to have a city school. And so they were able to move forward and convince them that they would do this little thing. They said, look, we've bought some land right next to you, which is where Clay is going to be, right? And he said, we'll sell that, and you're going to be stuck because you can't send your kids over there. Then you get to walk them across El Cajon, and they were, oh, what are we going to do, right? So they said, okay, and it sort of twisted their arms, and they went ahead and made a deal. And the city schools made a deal with La Mesa Spring Valley to buy Rolando Park Elementary and move it as a city school, and then build Clay, even though it's 5 blocks from Rolando, so that the city kids from San Diego could go to that school. And of course, the name Clay, it's now Pendleton. But yeah, so that was the deal that sort of brokered. That was the big drug out sort of fight in 1954, 55, right? And so they made the deal. And so I remember interviewing a couple people who had been at Rolando Park, and they left in June, and they said bye to all their teachers. And they came back in September, and there wasn't a single teacher or administrator, because all of those teachers said, we're staying with La Mesa Spring Valley. And so they had to create a whole new staff. And so he said it was like coming to a brand new school. We didn't know anybody. We didn't know anybody in our school. And I've been going here for 4 years. I didn't know anybody. So it's kind of fun. And eventually Clay would open up in 56, dedicated formally in 57. Right? And Rolando sort of had its own identity still, right, as an incorporated. In fact, our Miss Rolando in 1954 was the fairest of the fair, Joe Johnson, Helix High School. And then the year before it was Luann Dowd, who was Miss, but once they annexed in, then they sort of merged in. I can't remember if there was a Miss East San Diego or something, but we had, for a couple of years, we had our own Miss Rolando. And of course, Cajon Blvd was a happening place, even with the highway the freeway being built in, it still was a major commercial zone. We think about some of the annexes, and of course, Larry Imig, who was a guy who made his fortune building tract houses in Southeast San Diego, opened his little thing called the Imig Manor on Cajon Blvd, later sold, and it was changed into the Lafayette Hotel and recently restored. If you haven't, go there, have fun, and see some retro restoration, wonderful job. That was, of course, that, and I remember, luckily I was up in LA one day, researching an archive, and he said, oh, you're from San Diego. I've got some pictures of San Diego. I know what they are. And it was a picture of like a beauty contest around the pool at Imig. And I said, I know exactly where that was. And I ended up getting a copy for the Boulevard Association, who had given it to the previous owners. I haven't been able to check what they did with that photo, but they had blown it up. So it was about a 1949 photo or something like that. Anyway, and of course, other things you see. Oscar's, which is Mr. Peterson's first drive-in. He's the guy who's going to start that Jack in the Box company. This was down about 48th and El Cajon. Right, so retail and the fire that triggered that, and of course later that building would be for a long time Guitar Center. When we had a few recording studios in the 50s, 60s around here, they had Guitar Center was here for a while. That's where that all started from. A few little fun college-related businesses that used to be there drawing attention. And of course, the first supermarket to open was the Safeway, was later. Boy, was I excited when I moved here in 1994. I could walk to a Tower Records. That was like a dream when I was growing up. I had to drive across town in San Jose to go to a Tower Records. I could walk to a Tower Records. And of course, later, they FedMart and Rite Aid. And of course, we'll see what happens with it here in the near future. But that's the bones underneath that building. And there's our favorite Jack in the Box. The first one. Their ads in the local ad, that's from the Daily Aztec, they're just hilarious. They had the same ad and they would change the language every week. So it'd be like, this is in Arabic, and this is, because their menu was like 4 items. And so they would just change language. Oh, we've got a big menu, and they would just change the language every week. So they've always been joking in their marketing, I guess. And of course, the campus drive-in, an icon for many years. And so as we look, you could sort of just see there was some ball fields and there was some radio towers over there where now there's condos and apartments. There's the drive-in sort of just up from the dot there, give you an idea, but pretty much built out. University Avenue also had its commercial stuff along there. In fact, Mr. Cosgrove built that building right as you come next to the Taco Bell. There's a long building. That was, he originally built because he's building houses. It was sort of his version of Home Depot. You could buy anything for your landscape, plumbing fixture, whatever you needed. It was there to support you buying one of his houses, and then, oh, you can buy more stuff from me and fix up your house. So had it all figured out, right? And then we begin to see a few houses go into those lots as well as, like I said, all the houses, all the lots here, there was such demand for housing, all the lots here ended up being houses pretty much outside of El Cajon. And there's his store there, the CBM store, Cosgrove's building materials, and the college ever tract, Cosgrove Heights, etc. Of course, then in 1959, they decided to fill in much of Choyas Creek and put a little building over called the Unimart, which was the first of the sort of union-based, you had to be a member to go to the store. You had to be a union member to go to Unimart. And it was there from about 1959 and later became a Ralph's and Home Depot. And then it sat empty for about 10 years. And when we were here, we got some guys showed up from the Salvation Army to this meeting. And they said, we're looking for some help because we're looking for a spot to build a special community center. And Doris and I got tagged to be on that committee. And guess what? We got the Croc Center a few years. That was a great project. And we still have that great asset here that dates back to all that. All right. And of course, the first regional mall was the College Grove. I've got a whole lecture on Grossmont Center if you want that, but this was the first one and it opened up there, and that was a big change for the first mall. And of course, as we sort of roll through the decades, you know, we would make the news for important things like when it snowed, or the 4 little neighborhoods that would still fill in some of the gaps. Rolando, Glenwood, or maybe the condos that are there on 63rd and Acorn, right? And so by 1970s, it was just known as a wonderful suburban neighborhood where kids grew up and went to the local schools off Crawford Colts, they were all, and everything was just rolling along. Little League and Women's Club and all the things you would see in a typical subdivision of this community. And often on the other nights, it's a well-kept secret and then of course, we bought a house here and it was a secret. And it was way cheaper than Kensington. We got married, so, oh, no, Kensington's nice. Oh yeah, 280. Oh, there's no way. That's impossible. So we got to send Yeah, just right. And so we spent $160 on a turnkey, and everybody said, but they're only really worth $130. No, it's worth it. And anyway, so we just waited till it was tenfold and bought one in Kensington a couple years ago. But anyway, we'll get there. So anyway, well-kept secret, right? And I always know the date of that sign, which I helped broker through because that's our 6-week-old daughter right there that Jennifer's holding. So it's great, and that's there's a council member McCarty and her soon-to-be council member Madaffer sitting there, who were very supportive of this community over the years and very helpful to us. Jan's in there. Jan's in there. Oh yeah, she's there. Yeah, that was fun. Yep. I think there's that. We got one more. Whew, you made it through. Thank you. Sorry for the late start, but we got it through. So I squeezed all 4 into one for you, but you can always connect with us. You can come over to the Mesa History Center. Saturdays we're open, and like I said, we have some events coming up. We'll be doing a talk where I'll be bragging about Rolando to Kensington and Talmadge that, yeah, you were the same time. What's the big deal? And same contractors and stuff. And then, of course, in July, we'll be having our silent movie night. We're going to re-evict that up at the Trinity Church in Spring Valley, where they have a full theater organ in the church. And we've got our great friend Russ Peck, who lives in LA Gardens, who plays at Balboa Theater and plays for the organ. It's Society in Balboa Park. And we're going to show 2 films made in La Mesa area in 1911 and a feature, Douglas Fairbanks feature in that. So check our website, lamesahistory.com. And any questions you have now then, send us an email at the History Center. Follow us on social media. Yeah, good. Sure.
Any of the original houses that were built, it sounds like they were on Aragon.
Rolando, they're about, I think there's about 6 and 6 on Rolando and on Aragon. Most of them have been altered. The challenge that I could go into a whole lecture on historic preservation, because people are asking me all that. Yeah, we'd have to look. I think the Tudor one may be pretty good, but I mean, there's a set of criterion, and you have to really, not only historical architectural significance, but you have to show that what's called integrity, which is sort of like authenticity. And it's basically about the exterior facades. You could change the insides, and there's been a few discussions about, do we think we have a district? I think a lot of the houses here have probably been, because they were so small, a lot of them got altered. But I wouldn't count it out. I mean, we may have some.
It's funny you say that these are all tract homes because they don't.
These weren't tract, no, not in, over there, yeah. Off of Seminole and everything, yeah, Seminole and over there. But in Rolando, they're not. They were all one-offs. Yeah, they were one-offs. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so very much, everybody. Thank you so much.